Jack Reacher had no reason to stop in Solitude, Nevada. The name itself was a warning, etched onto a faded road sign peppered with buckshot. It was a place you passed through on your way to somewhere else, a blink-and-you-miss-it settlement shimmering in the vast, unforgiving heat of the desert. But the bus he was on, a rattling metal box smelling of stale coffee and desperation, had developed a cough that had turned into a death rattle. The driver, a man with a face like a worn-out road map, had managed to coast it into the dusty parking lot of a single-story building that served as the town's everything: diner, bus station, and unofficial gathering place. As Reacher stepped off the bus, the heat hit him like a physical blow. It was a dry, oppressive heat that sucked the moisture from your lungs and made the air taste of baked earth and distant regret. The town was little more than a single street, lined with buildings that seemed to be leaning on each other for support. There was a general store with a fly-blown display of canned goods, a sheriff's office with a single dusty patrol car parked out front, and a handful of houses that looked as if they had given up on the idea of ever being painted again. He walked into the diner, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a tired jingle. The place was empty except for a young woman behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She looked up as he entered, her eyes, the color of a faded desert sky, holding a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or perhaps just the deep-seated weariness of someone who had seen too many strangers pass through and too few of them bring anything good. "Bus is broken," Reacher stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the quiet of the room. The woman nodded, not missing a beat with her cloth. "Next one's through tomorrow, if you're lucky." "I don't feel lucky," Reacher said, his eyes scanning the room. He took in the faded photographs on the wall, smiling, hopeful faces from a time before the dust had settled on everything. He noticed the way the woman's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she worked. "No one ever is in solitude," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He ordered a coffee, black, and sat at the counter. The silence in the diner was heavy, punctuated only by the hum of the ancient refrigerator and the rhythmic squeak of the woman's cloth. He drank his coffee slowly, his mind a quiet, calculating machine, processing the subtle wrongness of the place. It was in the air, in the woman's guarded expression, in the unnatural quiet of a town that should have had at least the murmur of life. A man entered the diner, the bell jingling again, this time with a more aggressive, demanding tone. He was big, not as big as Reacher, but with the kind of soft, entitled bulk that came from a life of not being told no. He wore a pristine white shirt that seemed to defy the dust of the town, and his face was a mask of smug authority. He ignored Reacher and fixed his gaze on the woman. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of steel. "Mr. Thorne wants to see you." Sarah's hand stilled. The color drained from her face, leaving her with the pallor of old bone. "I'm working, Deputy." "Mr. Thorne doesn't like to be kept waiting," the deputy replied, his eyes flicking to Reacher for the first time, a quick, dismissive glance that sized him up and found him wanting. Reacher said nothing. He just watched, his coffee cup held loosely in his hand. He saw the tremor in Sarah's hand return, more pronounced this time. He saw the way she avoided the deputy's gaze, her eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor. "I'll be there when my shift is over," she said, her voice small but with a core of defiance that Reacher admired. The deputy took a step closer, his bulk crowding her against the counter. "I don't think you understand, Sarah. Mr. Thorne isn't asking." Reacher placed his coffee cup on the counter with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Both the deputy and Sarah turned to look at him. "She said she's working," Reacher said, his voice calm, even. It was a statement of fact, nothing more. But in the charged atmosphere of the diner, it was a challenge. The deputy's face hardened. "This doesn't concern you, Drifter. Finish your coffee and get back on your broken-down bus." Reacher didn't move. He just held the deputy's gaze, his own eyes as hard and unyielding as the desert rock outside. The air crackled with unspoken violence. The deputy, for all his bluster, was the first to look away. He shot a final venomous glare at Sarah before turning and stalking out of the diner, the bell jangling furiously in his wake. Sarah leaned against the counter, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered, her eyes wide with a fear that was now raw and undeniable. "He was leaning on you," Reacher said simply. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't know what this place is. You don't know who Mr. Thorne is." "Then maybe you should tell me," Reacher said, his gaze steady, offering a sliver of strength in the suffocating quiet of Solitude. He had a feeling his stay in this town was going to be longer than just one night, and he had a feeling that luck had nothing to do with it. Reacher spent the rest of the afternoon in the diner, nursing his coffee and watching the town that wasn't. There was no life, no movement on the single dusty street, no children playing, no neighbors gossiping over fences that had long since rotted away. It was a town holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, or perhaps for nothing to ever happen again. Sarah, whose name he had learned was Sarah Jensen, moved with a nervous energy, her eyes constantly darting to the door as if expecting the deputy to return with reinforcements. She answered Reacher's questions in clipped, reluctant sentences, her fear a palpable thing between them. The town, she explained, was owned in everything but name by one man, Alistair Thorne. He had arrived a decade ago, buying up the failing ranches and the dried-up mines, promising prosperity and a return to the town's former glory. At first, the people of Solitude had welcomed him as a savior. He had built a new processing plant on the outskirts of town, a massive, windowless structure that hummed with a constant, low-grade thrum, and had employed nearly everyone who was willing to work. But the prosperity had come at a price. Thorne's rules were absolute. His private security force, led by the deputy Reacher had encountered, a man named Miller, patrolled the town with an iron fist. Curfews were enforced, and any dissent was swiftly and brutally crushed. The town's sheriff was a man in Thorne's pocket, a hollowed-out shell of a lawman who did little more than collect his paycheck and look the other way. "What do they process at the plant?" Reacher asked, his eyes on the imposing structure that dominated the horizon. Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "They say it's for rare earth minerals, from the old mines." Reacher had seen his share of mining operations. They were messy, noisy affairs. Thorne's plant was too clean, too quiet. The low, constant hum suggested something else entirely, something that required a different kind of machinery, a different kind of secrecy. As evening approached, casting long, distorted shadows across the desolate street, a man came into the diner. He was old, his face a testament to a life of hard work and quiet endurance. He moved with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who had learned to conserve his energy. He introduced himself as Ben Carter, the town's mechanic and, as it turned out, the man who would be attempting to fix the bus. Carter's eyes, though weary, held a spark of defiance that Reacher recognized. He spoke in a low, careful voice, his words chosen with the precision of a man who knew the walls had ears. He confirmed Sarah's story, adding his own grim details. He spoke of people who had questioned Thorne and had simply disappeared, their families told they had packed up and left in the middle of the night. He spoke of a pervasive fear that had seeped into the very soul of the town, leaving its residents as empty and silent as the abandoned buildings that lined the main street. "Thorne's got this town in a stranglehold," Carter said, his voice a low whisper. "He's bleeding it dry, but no one knows what for, and no one's brave enough to find out." Later that night, Reacher walked the deserted streets of Solitude. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant, ever-present hum of Thorne's plant. He found his way to the sheriff's office, the single patrol car still parked in the same spot, a layer of dust already settling on its windshield. The office was dark, the windows empty and lifeless. He continued his walk, his senses on high alert. He was being watched. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their eyes on him, hidden in the shadows of the decaying buildings. Thorne's men, Miller's men. They were letting him know he was an outsider, a variable in their carefully controlled equation. He eventually found himself on the edge of town near the dirt road that led to Thorne's plant. A high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded the massive compound. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their silhouettes stark against the harsh glare of the floodlights. Whatever Thorne was doing in there, he was determined to keep it a secret. As Reacher stood there, hidden in the darkness, a truck rumbled out of the plant's main gate. It was a large, unmarked transport truck, the kind used for hauling heavy cargo. It turned onto the main road and headed out of town, its headlights cutting a swath through the inky blackness of the desert night. Reacher watched it go, a cold certainty solidifying in his gut. Whatever was happening in Solitude, whatever lie the town was built on, was being shipped out in trucks like that one. And he knew, with the unshakable conviction of a man who had seen the worst of what people were capable of, that he couldn't leave until he found out what was inside. The truth was a heavy cargo, and in a world of lies, someone had to be there to unload it. The next morning, Reacher was back at the diner. The bus was still out of commission, a fact that seemed to surprise no one. Ben Carter had confirmed that a crucial part was needed, and it would have to be ordered from a city hundreds of miles away. It was a convenient excuse, and Reacher knew it. He was being kept in Solitude for a reason. He was having his morning coffee when Miller, the deputy, walked in. He was flanked by two other men, both with the same hard, empty look in their eyes. They spread out, blocking the exits, their presence an unspoken threat. Miller sauntered up to the counter, a smug grin on his face. "Enjoying your stay, Drifter?" Reacher took a slow sip of his coffee. "It has its moments." Miller's grin widened. "I bet it does, but all good things must come to an end. We've arranged a ride for you. A car is on its way to take you to the next town. You can catch a bus from there." Reacher looked at Sarah. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, quickly extinguished by the fear that had become her constant companion. He looked back at Miller. "I'm comfortable here," Reacher said. Miller's face darkened. That wasn't a suggestion. Mr. Thorne is a man who values his privacy. He doesn't like strangers asking questions. "I haven't asked any questions," Reacher replied, his voice still calm, still even. "You're here, aren't you?" Miller shot back. "That's question enough." The standoff was broken by the arrival of another man. He was older than Miller, dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place in the dusty diner. His hair was silver, and his face was a mask of cold, calculating intelligence. This, Reacher knew, was Alistair Thorne. Thorne dismissed Miller and his men with a wave of his hand. He sat down at the counter, a few stools away from Reacher, and ordered a coffee. "Jack Reacher," Thorne said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. "Former military police. A man with a certain reputation." Reacher was surprised. He was used to being underestimated, to being seen as just another drifter. Thorne had done his homework. "You have me at a disadvantage," Reacher said. "I make it my business to know who is in my town," Thorne replied. "And you, Mr. Reacher, are a man who brings trouble with him. I'm a simple businessman. I don't like trouble." "Then you and I have something in common," Reacher said. Thorne smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "I doubt that. You see, I believe in order. I believe in control. And I have created a perfect, orderly world here in Solitude. A world without the chaos and unpredictability that you seem to thrive on." "There's a difference between order and oppression," Reacher countered. Thorne's smile vanished. "A matter of perspective. Now I'm going to make you an offer. I will have my men drive you to the nearest city. I will give you enough money to buy a new wardrobe and a ticket to anywhere you want to go. In return, you will forget you ever set foot in Solitude." It was a generous offer. A smart man would have taken it. But Reacher had never been one to walk away from a fight, especially when the fight was for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "I'm not for sale," Reacher said. Thorne's eyes turned to ice. "I was afraid you'd say that. A man of principle. How inconvenient." He stood up, his movements precise and deliberate. "You've made your choice, Mr. Reacher. I hope for your sake it was the right one." With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Reacher alone with the cold dregs of his coffee and the heavy certainty that the lies of Solitude were about to be brought into the harsh light of day. The truth, he knew, would come at a price. And in this town, it seemed the price was always paid in blood. That night, Reacher made his move. He knew that a direct assault on Thorne's plant was suicide. He needed information, a way in, and he knew just the person to ask. He found Ben Carter in his garage, working late on a pickup truck that looked as old and tired as he did. Carter's initial reluctance to help was understandable. He had a family to think about, a life to protect. But as Reacher laid out his plan, a spark of the old defiance returned to the mechanic's eyes. Carter told him about the plant's weak points. The security was tight, but there were patterns, routines. The guards changed shifts at 2 in the morning. There was a brief window, no more than 5 minutes, where the security was at its most vulnerable. He also told him about a drainage culvert that ran under the perimeter fence, a forgotten relic from the old mining days. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. As the town slept under a blanket of manufactured silence, Reacher made his way to the culvert. It was a tight squeeze, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. He emerged on the other side, inside the compound, his clothes covered in grime but his senses sharp, his mind focused. He moved through the shadows, a ghost in the machine. The plant was a maze of pipes and catwalks, the constant hum a disorienting presence. He avoided the roving patrols, his movements economical and precise. He was in his element, a predator in a world of unsuspecting prey. He found what he was looking for in a small, nondescript office tucked away in a corner of the main processing building. The computer was password protected, but Reacher had learned a few tricks during his time in the Army. A few keystrokes, a bit of social engineering based on the few scraps of information he had managed to glean about Thorne, and he was in. The files were encrypted, but the shipping manifests were not. They told a story that had nothing to do with rare earth minerals. The cargo was listed as agricultural equipment, but the weight and dimensions were all wrong. And the destination was a series of shell corporations in countries known for their lax regulations and their thriving black markets. He was about to dig deeper when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He quickly copied the manifests onto a small thumb drive and slipped out of the office, melting back into the shadows just as 2 guards rounded the corner. He made his way back to the culvert, the thumb drive a small, hard knot in his pocket. He had the what. He still needed the why. He found his answer in one of the large, windowless warehouses at the edge of the compound. The door was locked, but a locked door had never been much of an obstacle for Reacher. Inside, the air was cold, sterile, and in the center of the vast, empty space, under the harsh glare of a single bare bulb, was a single, long wooden crate. It was identical to the ones he had seen being loaded onto the transport trucks. He pried it open with a crowbar he had found leaning against a wall. The sound echoed in the cavernous warehouse. Inside, nestled in a bed of straw, were not agricultural equipment, but a dozen pristine, military-grade assault rifles, and underneath them, boxes upon boxes of ammunition. Thorne wasn't mining rare earth minerals. He was a gun runner, using the isolated town of Solitude as the hub of a massive illegal arms trafficking operation. The lies of Solitude were not just about control and oppression. They were about death and destruction, sold to the highest bidder. As Reacher stood there, the cold, hard reality of the situation settling in, he heard the sound of the warehouse doors sliding open. He was silhouetted against the light, a single, solitary figure in a world of lies. Thorne and a half-dozen of his men stood at the entrance, their faces grim, their weapons raised. "I must admit, Mr. Reacher," Thorne said, his voice dripping with mock admiration, "you are more resourceful than I gave you credit for. But your journey ends here." Reacher looked at the men, at their guns, at the cold, dead look in their eyes. He looked at Thorne, at the man who had built an empire on a foundation of lies and fear. And then he looked at the assault rifle in his hands. He had the truth. Now it was time to make it heard. The silence of Solitude was about to be broken. The ensuing firefight was a blur of motion and violence. Reacher used the crates as cover, his movements fluid and economical, a deadly dance he had perfected over years of training and experience. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he had something Thorne's men didn't, a reason to fight. He took them down one by one, his shots precise, his actions decisive. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of controlled chaos in the sterile confines of the warehouse. When the dust settled, only he and Thorne were left standing. Thorne, for all his intelligence and cunning, was not a fighter. He was a man who hid behind his money and his hired guns. He looked at Reacher, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You can't win," Thorne hissed, his voice trembling. "You're just one man." "I'm the one man you shouldn't have crossed," Reacher replied, his voice a low growl. The final confrontation was brief, brutal. Reacher disarmed Thorne with ease, the older man's movements slow, clumsy. He had him at his mercy, the truth of Solitude exposed, the lies shattered. But Reacher was not an executioner, he was a soldier. He left Thorne for the authorities, along with the evidence he had gathered. The state police, alerted by an anonymous tip from Ben Carter, arrived in force, their sirens a welcome sound in the once silent town. As the sun rose over the desert, casting its golden light on the town of Solitude, Reacher was on a bus, heading to the next town, the next adventure. He had come to Solitude by chance, a drifter with no destination. He left it a changed place, a town slowly, tentatively, finding its voice again. He looked out the window at the passing landscape, the vast, empty expanse of the desert. He had stood for the truth in a world of lies, and he knew, with a certainty that was as vast and as unyielding as the landscape before him, that he would do it again, because that's who he was, Jack Reacher. A man with no home, no possessions, but with a moral compass that always pointed true north. And in a world that was often lost, that was everything.